Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're stepping into a story where a wedding meant to celebrate love slowly turns into a test of dignity and respect. What happens when two families from completely different worlds finally collide, and one is forced to endure silent judgment? Will love be strong enough to protect what truly matters, or will pride tear everything apart before the big day arrives? Stay with me to find out. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The days leading up to the wedding passed, slowly yet quickly at the same time. For Tieu Lac, each morning felt a little different. She would wake up, look at her daughter sleeping peacefully beside her, then glance at the calendar, counting down the days without even realizing it. The wedding, something she had never truly imagined for herself. Not like this. Not after everything she had been through. The apartment had changed too. Not dramatically, but enough. Boxes of decorations lined the corners, fabric samples, invitation cards, small handwritten notes scattered across the table. Every little detail was being carefully considered, adjusted, reworked. The CEO had insisted on it. If we're doing this, he had said, we're doing it properly. Not extravagant, not loud, but meaningful. Tieu Lac sat on the floor that afternoon, carefully tying ribbons onto a stack of invitation cards. Her fingers moved slowly, focused, but her mind wandered. Is this too simple? She asked softly, holding one card up. The CEO sitting across from her glanced over. It's perfect, he said. She smiled faintly. You always say that. He leaned back slightly, watching her. Because you always overthink, he replied. She didn't deny it. Because this time, she was. Not about the wedding itself, but about everything around it. Her mother. The thought returned again. Quiet, persistent. The CEO noticed. He always did. She's coming tomorrow, he reminded her gently. Tieu Lac nodded. I know. But her voice didn't carry excitement. It carried something else. Are you worried? He asked. She hesitated, then finally, yes. Not fear, not doubt, but something deeper. I don't know how she'll feel here, Tieu Lac said quietly. This world, it's too different. She looked around the apartment, the clean lines, the quiet luxury. Everything that had slowly become normal to her, but never truly belonged to where she came from. I don't want her to feel like she doesn't belong, she added. The CEO leaned forward slightly. She won't, he said, but this time, even he knew, it wasn't something he could promise completely. The next day came. The CEO stood at the airport, his hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the crowd. For once, he felt something unfamiliar. Anticipation, not for business, not for negotiation, but for family. Then he saw her, Tieu Lac's mother, standing slightly apart from the crowd, holding a small worn bag close to her side. Her clothes were simple, neatly pressed, but clearly not from this world. Her eyes searched, uncertain, cautious. The CEO walked toward her, steady, respectful. Me, he greeted softly. She looked at him, a brief moment of hesitation, then nodded. You came yourself? She asked. He smiled faintly. Of course. He reached out, gently taking the bag from her hand. You don't have to carry this. She didn't resist. But she didn't fully relax either. The ride back was quiet at first. She looked out the window, watching the city pass by. Buildings rising higher than anything she had ever lived near, roads wider, cleaner, faster, different, too different. Everything is big here, she said softly. The CEO glanced at her. You'll get used to it. She didn't answer, because deep down, she didn't know if she wanted to. When they arrived at the apartment, Tieu Lac was already waiting. The moment she saw her mother step out of the car, everything else disappeared. Me! She ran forward, not caring about anything else, Not the building, not the surroundings, just her. Her mother smiled. Finally, a real one. "You've lost weight," her mother said immediately, touching her face. Tieu Lac laughed softly. "And you haven't changed at all." For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. Until the next day. The CEO had arranged a small meeting, nothing formal, just a meal. Both families, together. But everyone knew. It wasn't just a meal. The villa felt colder this time. Tieu Lac's mother stood slightly behind her, her hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes moved slowly around the space, taking in everything. The furniture, the decorations, the silence. She adjusted her sleeves unconsciously, a small gesture, but one that didn't go unnoticed. The CEO's mother sat at the table, perfect as always, controlled, unmoved. Her gaze shifted, not quickly, not openly, but carefully. From Tieu Lac to her mother, and stopped. A silence followed. Then a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "So, you've come," she said. Tieu Lac's mother nodded slightly. "Yes." No extra words, no unnecessary politeness, just presence. The CEO stepped forward. "We thought it would be good for everyone to meet," he said calmly. His mother didn't respond immediately. She simply gestured toward the table. "Sit." The meal began. At first, everything seemed normal. Questions, simple conversations, surface-level politeness. But underneath, something else was building. "So," his mother said suddenly, placing her chopsticks down lightly, "you've lived in the village your whole life?" Tieu Lac's mother nodded. "Yes." "And you never thought of moving somewhere better?" she asked. The question was light, but not harmless. Tieu Lac's fingers tightened under the table. Her mother paused, then answered calmly. "We live where we belong." A small silence. The CEO's father looked down at his bowl, saying nothing. His mother smiled again, still that same smile. "I suppose that's one way to see it." Then, her eyes moved slightly, taking in the clothes, the posture, the differences that couldn't be hidden. "This environment might feel unfamiliar," she added. This time, the meaning was clear. Tieu Lac's breath caught slightly, but before she could speak, her mother spoke first. "We didn't come here to compare," she said quietly. "We came because our children asked us to." Simple, direct. The room fell silent again. The CEO looked at her, just for a second, and in that second, something shifted. Because she hadn't lowered herself, she hadn't argued, but she hadn't accepted the weight either. The meal continued, but the tension stayed. And somewhere in that room, one truth became clear. The wedding was no longer just a celebration. It had become a test of pride, of acceptance, of how much someone was willing to endure for love. And as Tieu Lac glanced at her mother, seeing the quiet strength and the quiet restraint, a question formed in her heart. Would her mother continue to endure all this, just so she could be happy? Or would something break before the wedding even began? The tension didn't disappear after that meal. It stayed, lingering in the silence, in the glances no one acknowledged, in the small pauses between sentences that suddenly felt too long. That evening, back at the apartment, Tieu Lac's mother sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't complained. Not once. But Tieu Lac could see it. The difference. The weight, the quiet discomfort her mother tried so carefully to hide. "Me, are you okay?" Tieu Lac asked softly, sitting beside her. Her mother smiled, the same gentle smile she had always had. "I'm fine," she said. But this time, it didn't feel complete. "You don't have to say that," Tieu Lac whispered. "I know today wasn't easy." Her mother didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands. Then slowly, she spoke. "People like us," she said quietly, "we learn how to sit in places that don't belong to us." Tieu Lac's chest tightened instantly. "But that doesn't mean we don't feel it," her mother added. Silence. Tieu Lac reached out, holding her hand tightly. "I'm sorry," she said. Her mother shook her head. "No." A small pause. "You chose your life." Then, softer. "And I came because of that." There was no blame, no regret, but there was something else, something deeper, endurance. Across the room, the CEO stood quietly, listening. He hadn't meant to overhear, but he didn't step away either, because for the first time, he truly understood. It wasn't just about acceptance anymore, it was about dignity. The next day, the atmosphere shifted again. The CEO's mother had arranged another meeting. This time, not a meal, but something more deliberate, a dress fitting. She should have something appropriate, his mother had said earlier that morning. After all, it is a wedding. At first, it sounded reasonable, even thoughtful. Until they arrived, the boutique was elegant, quiet, every piece displayed perfectly, every detail controlled. Tieu Lac's mother stood at the entrance for a moment longer than necessary. Her eyes moved slowly, taking everything in, the fabrics, the lights, the people. "This is too much," she whispered. Tieu Lac squeezed her hand. "We don't have to." "Yes, we do," her mother said softly. Because she knew. This wasn't about clothes, it was about being measured. Inside, the CEO's mother was already waiting, seated, poised, unmoved. "You're late," she said lightly. No greeting. The CEO stepped forward. "We came as soon as we could." She nodded, then turned to the staff. "Show her something suitable." The word suitable lingered in the air. One dress, then another, each one more expensive, more structured, more unlike anything Tieu Lac's mother had ever worn. "She won't be comfortable in that," Tieu Lac said gently at one point. His mother glanced at her. "That's not the point." A pause. "The point is how she will be seen." Silence. Tieu Lac's mother stood there, still, listening. Then finally, she spoke. "I don't need to be seen differently," she said calmly. "I just need to be there." For the first time, the room shifted. The CEO's mother looked at her, really looked, and something, just for a moment, paused behind her eyes. But it didn't last. "This is not the village," she said quietly. "There are expectations. And there are limits," Tieu Lac's mother replied. No anger, no raised voice, but something stronger. The CEO stepped in. "That's enough," he said firmly. The room went still. His mother's gaze turned to him. "You're defending this?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "I'm protecting my family." A beat. Then, he reached out, gently, taking Tieu Lac's mother's bag from her hand. "We're leaving," he said. No argument, no negotiation, just a decision. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, even though nothing had been resolved. Tieu Lac's mother exhaled slowly. "I caused trouble," she said. "No," the CEO replied, "you didn't." Tieu Lac looked at both of them. Her eyes filled. But she didn't cry, because in that moment, she understood something clearly. This wedding was not just about love. It was about standing in the middle of two worlds and refusing to let one erase the other. That night, the apartment felt quieter than usual, but not heavy, not broken, stronger, because something had changed, lines had been drawn, and for the first time, no one stepped back. But far away, in the quiet, controlled space of her own room, the CEO's mother sat alone, her hands resting on the table. Still, her eyes distant, not angry, not emotional, just thinking. Because this time, she had seen something she hadn't expected. Not weakness, not dependence, but resistance. And as the wedding day drew closer, one thing became certain. This wouldn't be a quiet ceremony. It would be a moment where everything would finally be revealed. Not just love, but truth. As the wedding approaches, excitement is mixed with growing tension between two very different families. Tieu Lac's mother travels from the countryside to attend, carrying both love for her daughter and quiet insecurity about her place in this unfamiliar world. While the CEO stands firmly by his family, his mother begins to reveal subtle but painful judgments about class, appearance, and status. A meeting meant to bring both sides together slowly turns into a silent test of dignity. Despite facing discomfort and quiet humiliation, Tieu Lac's mother chooses to endure it for her daughter's happiness. However, the line between patience and self-respect begins to blur. As emotions build beneath the surface, one question remains. Will this wedding unite two families or expose a deeper divide that cannot be ignored?